Most people picture Eden as lush forest, crystal rivers, fruit on every branch, animals at peace. The truth today is something else entirely. In the exact spot identified by the 4 rivers of Genesis, there is scorching sand, oil refineries, ruins from recent wars, and a marshland that was nearly exterminated by a dictator. This is the story of what remains of paradise. Consider the geographic context before anything else. The book of Genesis, chapter 2, verses 10 through 14, describes with unusual precision 4 rivers flowing out of Eden: Tigris, Euphrates, Pishon, and Gihon. 2 of those names still exist on the map today, running exactly where the Bible said they would, cutting through the territory you now call Iraq. And it is precisely there, at the point where the Tigris and Euphrates meet, that you will find a gnarled tree surrounded by a rusted iron fence. The locals call that tree the Tree of Adam. You will understand in a few minutes why the Iraqi government built a sanctuary around a dead trunk. But first, consider the bigger picture. 21st century Iraq looks nothing like the paradise described in Genesis. The southern region, where the Fertile Crescent converges, has become one of the most devastated territories on the planet. 3 wars in 40 years. A dictator who decided to drain nearly 20,000 square kilometers of marshland to punish a population. And a progressive drought that is turning rivers into dust. Think about the biblical description again. Genesis 2, verse 10, the text says that a river flowed out of Eden and divided into 4 branches: Tigris, Euphrates, Pishon, which encircled the land of Havilah where there was fine gold, Gihon, which wound through the entire land of Cush. Tigris and Euphrates still flow. The other 2 have disappeared, though geological studies using satellite imagery have already identified fossil riverbeds in the Saudi desert and in Africa that match those descriptions. The most concrete reference lies in the rivers you can still visit today. The Tigris rises in the mountains of Turkey, so does the Euphrates. Both cross Syria, enter Iraq, and travel approximately 1,700 kilometers before meeting at a specific point. That point is called Al-Qurna. It sits 53 kilometers north of the city of Basra. And it is precisely this confluence of waters that most biblical archaeologists identify as the most likely location of the Garden of Eden. Scale what that means. You're standing before an area now dominated by dehydrated palm trees, asphalt cracked by heat, military checkpoints, and the constant sound of hydraulic pumps pulling oil from the bowels of the earth. Average summer temperatures reach 53 degrees Celsius. On certain days, 58 degrees have been recorded. For comparison, that is the same temperature you find inside an oven set to moderate heat. But there is still one more symbolic detail of this place to reveal. In the center of Al-Qurna, surrounded by an iron fence corroded by salt and pollution, stands a dead tree. A gnarled trunk, leafless, stripped of bark in several places, held upright by metal supports. The local inhabitants swear that this is the original tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They say it was planted by Adam after the expulsion. The tradition goes back to Syriac texts from the 4th century. Experts obviously question the claim, but the tree is there, and Islamic, Christian, and Jewish pilgrims have been visiting the site for at least 1,600 years. Look at the scene carefully. You are standing before a dead tree in the center of a poor city, in a country scarred by economic sanctions and successive wars. And this tree represents for millions of people the exact point where humanity began. The irony is devastating. The place associated with innocence, abundance, and harmony has become a symbol of exhaustion, conflict, and loss. Follow the process of geographic transformation. Before the 20th century, south of Qurna, you would have found something that more closely resembled the biblical description. It was the largest marshland area in the Middle East. 20,000 square kilometers of shallow waters, floating islands woven from interlaced reeds, navigable channels running in every direction, abundant fish, migratory birds arriving in their millions each winter. The inhabitants of that region were called the Madan, the Arabs of the marshes. They had lived there for at least 5,000 years, in direct continuity with the ancient Sumerian civilization. The Madan built entire houses from reeds. A structure called a mudhif could reach 20 meters in length with no nails, no solid wood, sustained entirely by the tension of reed bundles curved into arches. You could fit an entire bus inside one of those houses with room to spare. The Madan traveled in boats called mashufs, up to 10 meters long, propelled by pole. They fished with trident spears that look identical to those found in Sumerian carvings 4,500 years old. Imagine the complete picture. Well into the 20th century, entire populations living practically the same way their ancestors had lived when Abraham left Ur of the Chaldeans. Ur, incidentally, was just a few kilometers away. You could travel by boat from the city where Abraham was born, according to Genesis 11 verse 31, to the point believed to have been Eden in less than 2 days of navigation. And then everything collapsed in less than a generation. In 1980, Iraq invaded Iran. The war lasted 8 years, more than 1 million dead on both sides combined. The most brutal battles took place precisely in the region of Basra and Shat al-Arab, the river formed by the junction of Tigris and Euphrates below Kurna. You do not need much imagination to understand what happened to the environment. Trenches cut through the marshes, tanks sinking in areas never designed to bear military weight, oil spills from hundreds of destroyed armored vehicles, chemical weapons used by the Iraqi regime against civilian and military targets, with residues seeping into the water table. The most brutal work against the place had not even begun. In 1991, after Iraq's defeat in the First Gulf War, Shia populations in the south rebelled against the central government. The Madan, for the most part, supported the uprising. Saddam Hussein responded with a decision that would alter the geography of the place for centuries to come. He ordered the complete drainage of the marshes. Calculate the magnitude of what that meant. Artificial canals were constructed with propaganda names like River of the Mother of All Battles and Saddam River. 3 main canals totaling more than 500 kilometers in length. The purpose was to divert water from the Tigris and Euphrates before it reached the marshes, causing the entire ecosystem to dry out. Giant hydraulic pumps, capable of moving thousands of cubic meters per second, were installed at strategic points. In just 10 years, 90% of the 20,000 square kilometers of marshland had been turned into cracked desert. Scale that number. 90% of an area equivalent to nearly half the state of Sergipe was converted from living marsh to barren earth in a single decade. This was not the work of nature. It was not the work of time. It was a political decision executed with military engineering. The Madan, who numbered approximately 500,000 people in 1990, were reduced to fewer than 20,000 by 2003. Most fled to Iran, to Jordan, to refugee camps in Saudi Arabia. Those who stayed watched their traditions die, their distinct language disappear, their diet built around fish and rice grown along the water's edge vanish, and with it the very ability to build mudhifs because the reeds no longer grew. Silence. The American invasion in 2003 toppled Saddam Hussein. Local populations, in an act of symbolic revolt, opened dikes and destroyed drainage pumps with their own hands. The water began to return, but what returned was not what had existed before. The soils had dried so completely that they had hardened into salt crusts. The original vegetation, gone. The fish vanished. Migratory birds that had once arrived in their millions no longer recognized the route. Even so, in 2016, UNESCO declared the Mesopotamian marshes a World Heritage Site. An area of approximately 16,000 hectares was officially protected. Today, it is estimated that only 40% of the original marshland has recovered in any meaningful measure, and even that percentage faces constant threat. On the outside, the place appears to be healing. On the inside, the reality is something else. Examine the details of what unfolded alongside the environmental disaster. Beneath that soil, directly below the point where Genesis placed Eden, lie some of the largest oil fields on the planet. The Rumaila field, discovered in 1953, contains approximately 17 billion barrels of recoverable oil. For comparison, that is more petroleum than Brazil holds in all its confirmed reserves. The West Qurna field, located just a few kilometers from Al Qurna, contains another 21 billion barrels. Majnoon, further north, another 12 billion. Add it all up, you are standing before more than 50 billion barrels of oil, concentrated in the exact place where the biblical tradition locates the earthly paradise. The irony cuts through any theological interpretation. Eden has become one of the largest deposits of fossil fuel in human history. Follow what this means in daily practice. Refineries run 24 hours a day. Natural gas flares burn without interruption, forming an artificial constellation of flames visible in satellite images at night. Air quality in Basra, the largest nearby city, is considered among the worst in the world. Cancer rates in the region rose sharply after the wars, especially among children. Studies published between 2005 and 2015 showed an increase of nearly 300% in certain types of childhood leukemia in southern Iraq. The water also grew scarce. The Tigris and Euphrates, flowing from Turkey, have lost approximately 40% of their historical volume over the last few decades. Turkey built 22 major dams under a project called GAP, retaining water for irrigation and electricity generation. Syria built more dams. By the time water finally reaches Iraq, it arrives already reduced, contaminated by pesticides, and with increased salinity. In some stretches of Shatt al-Arab, salinity already exceeds that of seawater, rendering it unfit for use. Think about the contrast again. The biblical text describes in Genesis 2 a place where man was set to cultivate the ground already made moist by a mist rising from the earth, where there was fine gold, bdellium and onyx stone, where the river divided into 4 branches. The place today is the exact opposite. Soils cracked from lack of water, air heavy with soot, populations fighting for drinking water in cities approaching 3 million inhabitants. And the work of those who have survived there carries a very specific brutality. Workers at the refineries of southern Iraq endure 12 to 14-hour shifts, in temperatures reaching 50 degrees, handling equipment that processes flammable and toxic materials. Average life expectancy in the oil-producing region has dropped to 62 years, 8 years below Iraq's national average. Respiratory diseases affect approximately 60% of the adult population of Basra. Neurological disorders linked to heavy metals in the water supply increased 400% between 2000 and 2020. The fishermen who still try to live off what remains of the marsh tell a particular story. They set out before dawn, navigate for hours, and return with baskets that once weighed 20 or 30 kilos full of fish and now weigh 2 or 3. The historic species, such as the binny, a type of local carp that formed the backbone of the Maidan diet, have virtually disappeared. Fishermen now catch invasive Asian carp, small fish with a different flavor, sold at low prices in local markets. And those who care for the children tell another parallel story. The infant mortality rate in some rural areas around Basra reached 72 deaths per 1,000 live births at the height of the economic sanctions of the 1990s. Even after improvements following the American invasion, the rate remains around 28 per 1,000, nearly 3 times the global average. The most common causes are diseases linked to contaminated water, respiratory infections, and malnutrition. Months of waiting for medical appointments, 3 hours of travel to the nearest hospital equipped for emergencies, medications missing from public pharmacies. Witness the exact moment when the sun rises over Al-Qurna. The yellowish light cuts through atmospheric pollution, creating an effect that is almost orange, as if you were seeing the place through an old photographic lens. The dominant sound is not the song of birds, as described in rabbinical texts about Eden. It is the constant rumble of oil pumps, layered with the hum of electric generators sustaining what remains of the public grid. At times, the wind carries the smell of sulfur drifting from the refineries. On days of sandstorm, the air turns orange and visibility drops to less than 50 meters. Follow what you cannot see without guidance. Beneath the soil, in geological strata dated to more than 6,000 years ago, archaeologists have identified traces of a civilization that coincides with the Proto-Sumerian period. Eridu, considered by many the oldest city in the world, lies just 23 kilometers from what is believed to have been the heart of Eden. It was continuously inhabited from approximately 5,400 years before Christ. Sumerian texts speak of a paradisiacal place called Dilmun, described with characteristics strikingly similar to the biblical Eden: fresh water springing from the ground, the absence of disease, the absence of death. These texts are older than the Book of Genesis in its written form. 3,500 years. That is the minimum distance between the oldest Sumerian tablets about Dilmun and the oldest Hebrew manuscripts of Genesis. Yet both describe essentially the same place. The archaeological record reveals something no one expected. That region of southern Iraq, today exhausted, was the true cradle of human agriculture. The first domesticated plants, wheat, barley, lentils, emerged on lands that today cannot be cultivated without intensive irrigation and industrial fertilizers. The first planned irrigation systems appeared there approximately 6,000 years ago. The first organized cities with centralized administration arose from those soils. The first written legal codes, the first schools, the first libraries, and the first recorded poems, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains a flood narrative parallel to that of Noah in Genesis 6 through 9. All of this happened in the exact place where today you find industrial ruins, impoverished populations, and collapsing ecosystems. Calculate what is happening now. Iraq is living through one of the worst droughts of the last 100 years. Average temperatures have risen 2 degrees since 1980. Dust storms, once rare, now occur on average 80 days a year in some regions of the south. The storms carry fine particles that penetrate lungs and eyes. In 2022, in just 1 week, more than 5,000 Iraqis were hospitalized for respiratory problems caused by a sandstorm that struck Basra and neighboring cities. The marshes, partially restored after 2003, are drying out again. In 2023, UNESCO issued formal warnings about the risk of permanent loss of the area. Salinity increased, temperatures rose, tributary flows diminished. Experts from the Nature Iraq project estimate that, if current trends continue, by 2035, the marshland area could be reduced to less than 5% of its historical extent. No engineer in the world has managed to fully reverse the damage. Return to the Tree of Adam in Al-Qurna. The trunk is dying slowly. Local authorities do what they can to preserve it. They apply chemical treatments against termites. They reinforce the iron fence. They repaint the protective wall. But the tree has been dead for at least 50 years. What exists there is a wooden crypt, a dry reliquary of a tradition that survives in the minds of those who visit, not in the physiology of the trunk. Observe the symbolic coincidence. The place associated with the origin of humanity in the Judeo-Christian tradition today preserves only remnants of marshland, remnants of civilizations, remnants of a dead tree, remnants of displaced populations, remnants of native fauna, and over all of it, built by the force of oil money, an industrial apparatus that extracts from the subsoil a dark liquid that fuels engines on every continent. The story of Eden, in current geographic terms, is the story of a place transformed into a fuel supplier for a world that has forgotten where it came from. Pass through the scene one final time. South of Baghdad, driving on paved roads that cut through once fertile sandscapes, you arrive at Al-Qurna. You find the monument to Adam, the rusted tree, the point where two biblical rivers meet for the last time before becoming Shat al-Arab and emptying into the Persian Gulf. You feel the heat. You breathe the air thick with burned oil. You hear the silence of the dried marshes. What exists today in the place where the Garden of Eden once stood is memory. Memory sedimented in archaeological layers, memory preserved in ancient texts, memory told by fishermen who still navigate where they can, memory carried by Madan refugees scattered across the Middle East. The geography has changed, the climate has changed, the population has changed, but the reference, that point where human tradition placed the origin of everything, remains marked on maps and in collective memory. And perhaps that is the most brutal lesson of the place. What is described as paradise in the oldest tradition of Western humanity has become a symbol of its exact opposite: war, exile, environmental degradation, economic exploitation, human suffering on an industrial scale. The place where, according to the text, everything began well has become a concrete demonstration of everything that can go wrong when successive civilizations take from the land without caring for what they received. Eden is there. Over it today rests the weight of everything that came after.